For years, the Council had observed Earth with great interest, convinced that humanity's defining trait was its politeness. They saw a species that followed rules, respected authority, and avoided conflict. From their distant vantage point, Earth seemed like an ideal example of peace and order. The humans interacted with each other in a way that seemed calm and controlled, even in times of pressure. There were no signs of rebellion, no hints of aggression. It was almost as though their entire society was built on the foundation of politeness. To the Council, this was the perfect species, one that could be trusted to follow the rules without hesitation. They were a species that would never disrupt the peace. However, something strange had been happening recently, something the Council had not expected. Small changes, almost imperceptible at first, began to show up in the data they were collecting. It started with simple things. An argument between two people in a cafe that escalated in a way that was uncharacteristic of humans. A disagreement over something minor became a shouting match. Then, a few weeks later, a politician, usually calm and measured, lost his temper during a public debate. He raised his voice, slammed his fists on the podium, and spoke with an intensity that shocked the audience. This wasn't how humans behaved. Something was off. The Council, always cautious and observant, dismissed these incidents as mere outliers, events that could happen in any society. But soon, the incidents became more frequent. The data they received showed an increase in violent outbursts, arguments, and protests. People who had once kept to themselves now openly shouted at each other in the streets. In workplaces, tensions grew high. Teachers found themselves struggling to keep control of their classrooms, and even family gatherings became uncomfortable, filled with bitter arguments. Everywhere, the same disturbing trend was visible. Humanity's politeness, the very quality that made them seem so controlled, was starting to disappear. The Council's representatives studied the data, trying to make sense of it. They were skilled at interpreting behavior, but this was unlike anything they had seen before. What could be causing this sudden shift? Earth's leaders appeared as confused as the Council. Governments that had once been strong and steady were now facing open defiance. People were no longer afraid to speak their minds, and more troublingly, they were not afraid to speak their anger. What had once been a society governed by civility was now turning into one filled with discord. The news spread quickly. Riots began to break out in several major cities. The protests, once peaceful demonstrations for change, now turned into violent clashes. People were no longer quietly demanding change from their governments. They were taking to the streets in anger, confronting law enforcement, and demanding something more radical. What was truly frightening to the Council was that no one seemed to be backing down. The anger wasn't just a response to government policies or social issues. It was a complete breakdown of the system. Humanity was no longer following the rules. They had cast off their civility and embraced something far more dangerous: rebellion. The Council scrambled to understand what was happening. They had studied human history and society extensively. They knew that revolutions could happen, but they were always sparked by something external: an event, a leader, a war. Yet, this was different. There was no obvious trigger. No event had sparked this sudden shift. It was as if the humans had simply decided, without warning, that they no longer wanted to live according to the rules. It was as if they had decided that the polite mask they had worn for centuries had to come off, and with it, all the anger and frustration they had buried for so long came pouring out. One night, as the Council watched Earth from their distant observation posts, they received an encrypted message. It was short, direct, and chilling. "We are done being polite. We will no longer follow your rules." The message was sent by an unknown source, but its meaning was unmistakable. Humanity had made a decision. They were no longer the controlled, peaceful species the Council had once thought them to be. They had reached their breaking point. The floodgates had opened, and there was no going back. As the Council members read the message, a sense of unease settled over them. They had misjudged humanity. They had assumed that their politeness was a sign of weakness, but it was actually a sign of restraint. For centuries, humans had kept their anger in check, following rules and social norms because they believed it was the right thing to do. But now, it seemed, that restraint had vanished. The council had underestimated the power of humanity's emotions, and now they were about to find out just how dangerous that could be. In cities across the planet, the signs were impossible to ignore. People were openly defying authority, refusing to cooperate with governments and institutions. The police, once seen as the enforcers of law, were now viewed with suspicion and hostility. Workers walked off their jobs, students skipped school, and entire communities began to unravel. The once solid foundation of order and civility was crumbling before the council's very eyes. The leader of one of the most vocal protest movements stood before a crowd in a city square, his voice ringing out above the chaos. "We have been polite for far too long," he shouted, his words echoing through the streets. "We've obeyed every rule, followed every law, and still we suffer. No more. We take control of our own lives now. No one will tell us how to live anymore." His words struck a chord with the people. The crowd erupted in cheers, the energy in the air palpable. The leader's speech was broadcast worldwide, igniting similar protests across the globe. The message was clear. Humanity was done being polite. They were done with rules that kept them in check. They wanted change, and they were willing to fight for it. Back in their observation posts, the council knew the situation had become critical. Humanity, once so easy to manage, was no longer under their control. The storm was coming, and there was no telling where it would lead. What had started as a small crack in their perfect image of humanity had turned into a full-scale rebellion, and now the council was left to watch as the planet they had so carefully observed descended into chaos. As the days went by, humanity's shift from civility to chaos became impossible to ignore. What had started as isolated incidents of discontent was now an uncontainable wave of unrest. Cities once known for their calm, orderly life were now plagued by open defiance and violent outbreaks. The signs were everywhere. People no longer followed traffic rules. Lines at stores turned into shouting matches, and civil debates in the public sphere became rare. Civility, the very thing that had defined humanity's peaceful coexistence, had begun to crumble, and what replaced it was something the council had never imagined. The first large-scale riot took place in a major city center. It began with a small disagreement between two people in a crowded market, but quickly spiraled out of control. What should have been a simple conflict turned into a massive brawl, and before long, hundreds of people were involved, yelling and throwing objects at each other. The police arrived, but instead of restoring order, they were met with resistance. People who had once looked up to their authorities with respect now saw them as a symbol of oppression. The authorities were quickly overpowered, and chaos spread like wildfire. The council, watching these events unfold from their far-off observation posts, was in complete shock. How had humanity gone from polite, docile beings to a species that could barely contain their anger and frustration? What triggered this sudden, violent turn? The rebellion was spreading, and they still had no answers. Every time they tried to investigate the cause, the answers seemed evasive. There were no clear leaders, no grand conspiracies, just ordinary people refusing to follow the rules. As the weeks passed, more cities fell into disarray. What had once been calm demonstrations turned into full-scale uprisings. Protesters, now emboldened by their own anger, began to take more drastic actions. There were no longer just small protests in the streets. There were attacks on government buildings, sabotage of key infrastructure, and even violent clashes with law enforcement. People began to destroy the things that represented order and control: government offices, banks, police stations. No one was safe from the rising tide of anger. The protests were no longer just about political change. They were a fight for humanity's very soul. It was no longer about civility. It was about reclaiming control from those who had kept them in check for so long. The leader of the resistance movement, a charismatic and powerful figure, became a symbol of humanity's fight for freedom. His speeches, delivered through hacked broadcasts and hidden live streams, reached millions. His message was simple, yet powerful. We are not weak. We are not just the polite species you thought we were. We are human, and we have been holding back for too long. You thought you could control us with your rules, but now we will take back what is ours. We are done being silent. His words resonated with the angry masses. The council had always believed that the politeness of humanity was their greatest strength. Now they realized it had been their greatest weakness. The entire world was waking up, and they no longer feared the consequences of their actions. People began to rally behind the leader's call for change, and the movement grew exponentially. The protests, once confined to specific regions, now spanned the entire globe. It was as though a wave of rebellion had swept across humanity, and there was no way to stop it. People who had once been law-abiding citizens were now acting out of a deep, collective frustration. Some joined the cause, while others simply refused to comply. Those who resisted were increasingly met with violence. Governments struggled to regain control of their cities, but with each failed attempt, they only added fuel to the fire. Meanwhile, the council struggled to understand what was happening. Their intelligence reports came in, but they seemed disjointed, lacking any cohesive explanation. Some said it was an economic collapse. Others suggested a global conspiracy, but no one had an answer that made sense. The people were simply rejecting authority. Even the council's most advanced diplomats, who had dealt with rebellious species in the past, could not fathom the scale of this crisis. How could a species, so compliant and controlled for centuries, suddenly descend into this level of chaos? Desperation began to set in among the council's ranks. For the first time, they feared the consequences of their actions. They had always assumed that humanity was weak, that their politeness was a sign of submission. But they were wrong. Humanity was not weak. They had simply been patient. They had followed the rules because they believed they were the right thing to do. But that patience had a breaking point. The council had pushed humanity too far, and now they were seeing the result. The council debated their next move. Should they intervene directly? Should they send military forces to quell the uprisings? Should they try to negotiate with humanity's leaders and restore order? But every plan felt like a gamble. No one knew if humanity could be controlled again. What they didn't understand was that the people of Earth didn't just want to return to the old ways. They wanted something completely new. They were fighting for their autonomy, their right to choose their own path, and to be free of the constraints that had been placed upon them for centuries. The rebellion grew more organized, and the leader of the resistance began to demand more than just the end of external control. He began to rally people for a new world order, a world where humanity would no longer be subject to the Council's gaze, where Earth would no longer be part of their intergalactic empire. It was no longer about politics, it was about freedom. As the Council scrambled to come up with a plan, humanity's anger reached new heights. It was no longer just about fighting against their oppressors. It was a battle for survival. The leader of the rebellion called on all humans to unite, to fight for the future of their planet, and for the future of their species. And in the streets, the message was clear. Humanity would no longer be polite. The Council was now watching as humanity burned through the politeness that had once kept them in check, and they knew, deep down, that they were losing control over a species they had underestimated. The question now wasn't how to regain control, but if they could stop humanity at all. The world had transformed. What was once a planet known for its civility, order, and politeness was now a battleground. A place where humans were determined to reclaim their freedom, no matter the cost. The rebellion had reached its full potential, and humanity had thrown off the shackles of politeness that the Council had so long admired. What began as scattered protests had turned into a global revolution, and the entire planet was caught in its fire. In the heart of major cities, streets once calm and quiet were now filled with smoke, broken glass, and the sound of shouting. What began as a series of peaceful protests for better conditions had morphed into widespread violence. Government buildings burned as citizens turned their anger into action. Armies of police officers, once viewed as symbols of peace and authority, now found themselves fighting against the very people they had sworn to protect. The law no longer held sway. Instead, people acted on pure emotion, and that emotion was anger. But this wasn't just mindless destruction. No, it was something deeper, something far more dangerous. Humanity was no longer merely angry at their rulers. They were angry at the very idea of being controlled. What started as a fight for better conditions had evolved into a fight for sovereignty, for autonomy. Earth was no longer a colony of the Council. It was a world determined to shape its own destiny. The leader of the rebellion, once an unknown figure, had become the rallying cry of an entire planet. His voice, broadcast through hacked communication channels, resonated with every person who had ever felt oppressed, ignored, or silenced. His speeches, powerful, raw, and unrelenting, were filled with calls for freedom. "We were not born to serve. We were not born to be polite," he would shout. "We were born to fight for our future." Humanity's newfound boldness was evident in every aspect of their revolution. Cities organized themselves into clusters of resistance forces. Groups of civilians, once passive in their lives, now took on military roles. They built makeshift weapons, hacked government systems, and formed alliances with rebellious factions across the globe. The world was no longer united by politeness. It was united by a common cause, to drag out the Council and make their own choices. The Council watched, horrified, as their once docile experiment spiraled out of control. They had never expected this, humanity's ability to rise up against them so quickly, so violently. They had always believed that politeness was a sign of weakness, that humans could easily be manipulated, but they were wrong. Humanity's politeness wasn't a sign of submission. It was a sign of restraint. And when that restraint was shattered, humanity's anger, power, and determination exploded. Desperation began to set in among the Council's leaders. They had seen rebellious species before, but never one so unpredictable. The Council had always dealt with wars, uprisings, and revolutions, but nothing prepared them for the sheer force of human will. They tried to exert their influence by sending peacekeepers, offering negotiations, and attempting to divide humanity with promises of power. But nothing worked. Humanity was beyond talking now. They didn't want to negotiate with their oppressors. They wanted to overthrow them entirely. The Council's first major mistake had been thinking that they could control humanity through politeness alone. The second mistake was underestimating the sheer power of a united people fighting for their freedom. The third mistake came when they tried to deploy their advanced technology, ships and drones designed to subdue rebellious planets, but were met with a stunning surprise. Humanity had learned. They had adapted. Earth's scientists, engineers, and hackers had been working in secret for months, reverse engineering alien technology and building their own weapons. The initial strikes had been small, a few hacked drones here, a rogue missile launcher there. But as the rebellion grew, so did humanity's capacity for resistance. The final straw came when Earth's best minds, working in hidden laboratories, developed a weapon capable of bringing down the Council's most powerful ships. A weapon designed to disrupt the very technology that the Council had thought made them invincible. The Council's fleet was massive, far more advanced than any weapon humanity had at their disposal. Yet Earth's resistance had managed to create something new. The weapon they had developed wasn't a physical one. It was a wave of electromagnetic pulses designed to shut down the very systems that powered the Council's ships and drones. They didn't have the firepower to match the Council's fleets, but they had something even more dangerous: the element of surprise. When the first of the Council's ships entered Earth's orbit, expecting to neutralize the rebellion with a show of force, they were met with a shocking reality. A high-tech electromagnetic pulse shot up from Earth's surface, targeting the ship's control systems. One by one, the Council's fleet began to malfunction. The ship's systems short-circuited, their engines failed, and their weapons were rendered useless. The once mighty fleet, feared throughout the galaxy, now hung useless in space, slowly drifting toward the planet. For the first time, the Council realized the scale of their mistake. They had underestimated humanity's ability to innovate, to adapt, and to fight back. As the ships began to fall, the rebellion on Earth erupted in celebration. The message was clear. Humanity was no longer powerless. Humanity was no longer polite. Humanity was a force to be reckoned with. As the Council scrambled to figure out how to respond, humanity's ground forces pushed forward. Armed with makeshift weapons, now upgraded with alien technology, they stormed government buildings, military bases, and key installations. The human resistance was everywhere, and the once imposing council structures were crumbling. No longer were the people afraid to take action. No longer did they obey the orders of an alien force. They had tasted what it was like to fight for their own future, and they would not stop until they had won. The rebellion had officially gone global. Earth was now a war zone, but it was a war zone with a single unified goal: freedom. The Council's control over humanity had slipped away, and they were now fighting to regain the upper hand. But they knew, deep down, that Earth was no longer just another planet to rule. It was a planet determined to stand on its own 2 feet, and that frightened the Council more than anything else. Humanity had turned the tables. The Council could no longer count on humanity's politeness. They could no longer count on control. Earth had awoken, and it was no longer going back to sleep. The storm had been unleashed, and the Council had no idea what it was about to face. The rebellion had reached a fever pitch. What began as a handful of protests had now transformed into an all-out war. The Council, once confident in their control over humanity, had watched helplessly as their influence slipped away. The rebel forces had defeated the Council's fleet in orbit, and now they were pushing forward, armed with alien technology and a newfound resolve. Earth's cities had become battlefields, and no place was untouched. Every corner of the globe now vibrated with the echoes of humanity's defiance. The leader of the rebellion stood at the forefront of this fight, his voice now the rallying cry of a planet in revolt. His speeches had ignited the hearts of millions, and the fires of rebellion burned brighter with every passing day. "This is our world," he declared in his latest broadcast. "We will not kneel to those who think they can rule us. We are not their servants. We are their equals, and we will make them understand that." The Council, now realizing they were facing something far beyond their expectations, had begun to panic. Their once advanced technology was no longer as infallible as they had believed. The electromagnetic pulse weapon Earth had deployed had proven far more devastating than they could have imagined, and their ships, once symbols of unstoppable power, had been rendered useless. Worse yet, the human resistance had shown them that they could adapt faster than the Council ever could. Earth was not a species to be underestimated. The Council convened in a desperate meeting. Far from Earth, in their hidden stronghold, they discussed their options. Should they send in reinforcements from other systems? Should they abandon Earth altogether? Or should they risk everything and launch a full-scale invasion to reclaim control? But every option felt flawed. Every solution seemed inadequate. They had no idea how humanity had united so quickly, or how they had turned the tide in such a short amount of time. "We cannot back down," one council member argued, his voice shaking with fear. "Earth has already demonstrated they can disable our technology. We cannot let them believe they can win. If we do, they will become a threat to us all." Others nodded in agreement, but the mood in the room was far from confident. The once mighty council was crumbling from within, realizing they had failed to control a species that, only weeks ago, seemed so passive and polite. Now, humanity was ready for the final confrontation. Back on Earth, the leader of the rebellion had a plan, a final daring move to ensure that the Council would never threaten Earth again. The weapon that had disabled the alien fleet had come at a high cost. It had drained Earth's power reserves and crippled many of their own communication systems. But it was enough to show the Council that their reign over the planet was over. Now the Resistance was preparing for one final assault, a battle to take the heart of the Council's operations. The plan was risky. The rebel forces, though growing in number, were still outmatched by the Council's advanced weaponry and resources. But the leader of the rebellion understood one truth. Humanity had nothing left to lose. They had already torn down the walls of oppression. Now they would fight to build a new world from the ashes. The final battle would take place at the Council's last remaining stronghold, a massive fortress located far from Earth on a remote moon. The Council had retreated there, hoping to regroup and plan their next steps. But they underestimated how far the rebellion would go. The leader of the Resistance had assembled a coalition of Earth's best minds. Engineers, hackers, military strategists, and civilians, to launch a coordinated strike. The rebels had one goal: to infiltrate the Council's stronghold, destroy their control systems, and cut off their connection to Earth permanently. If they succeeded, the Council would have no way of reaching Earth, and humanity would be free to chart its own course. The final assault was launched. Rebel forces, using a combination of stealth ships, cyber-attacks, and sheer numbers, managed to break through the Council's defenses. The skies above the stronghold erupted with fire and explosions as Earth's forces clashed with the remaining Council defenders. The battle was fierce, with both sides fighting with everything they had left. But humanity's drive was unmatched. The rage that had been building for decades now fueled every action, every movement. In the heart of the stronghold, the leader of the rebellion and his team breached the control room, a vast chamber filled with alien technology and vast arrays of data. The Council's final hope lay in this room. If they could protect their command systems, they could continue to control Earth remotely, pulling the strings from afar. But the leader of the rebellion wasn't about to let that happen. With a final, determined push, the rebels destroyed the central control systems, shutting down the last remaining lines of communication between the Council and Earth. At that moment, everything changed. The Council, now completely isolated, had lost. The rebels had won. The war was over. Back on Earth, the news spread like wildfire. Humanity had defeated the alien overlords who had tried to control them. For the first time in centuries, the people of Earth were free to determine their own future, without fear of interference from those who had thought they could govern them. The world was no longer bound by the rules of the Council. It was theirs to shape. The leader of the rebellion, standing in front of a massive crowd, raised his fist in victory. "This is not the end," he said, his voice ringing out across the world. "This is the beginning. Today, we reclaim our future. We will rebuild, we will grow, and we will never again be ruled by fear. We are humanity, and we are free." The world erupted in cheers. People from every corner of the globe celebrated their victory, knowing that they had not only freed themselves from the Council's rule, but had also proven something even greater, that they would never again live in the shadow of someone else's control. Humanity had learned the most valuable lesson of all. No one could control them, and no one could take away their right to choose their own destiny. The Council, now defeated and scattered across the galaxy, watched as Earth's celebrations continued. They had underestimated humanity, and that was the last mistake they would ever make. Humanity had risen, had fought back, and had emerged victorious. The future of Earth was no longer in the hands of the Council. It was in the hands of its people, and they would never forget the price of their freedom.